Well, hello everybody, this is dear Mama Sal on Thursday morning. Yay, Thursday, which is my Friday. It's a chilly 10 degrees, chilly as in 50 if you're in the States, that's what it would translate to. And as I said yesterday, huge windstorms had come up overnight, and I was joking about how it had torn down so many signs. By the time I got to work, there was an outage. We had no power. Now, in Canada, we call anything to do with power hydro. Because that's where we get a lot of our power from, is from hydroelectricity. And so if you hear me talk about hydro, that's what I mean. So I have to translate in both official languages. So anyway, I got to work and it was pitch black going up the staircase to work. You knew that was a problem. And then I got to my desk. That was pretty dark as well. And you don't really think about it too much because you know that it's not going to last that long. Well, this outage lasted that long. We actually got power back sometime in the early afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock, I would think, somewhere in there. But the power surge that we got when it came back on fried the Visa machine. Basically threw all our servers, internet servers and stuff, out of whack. And we spent the rest of the afternoon starting and restarting all our servers and still didn't get very far. So it was a totally wasted day for some people. And what I wanted to talk about was, I wonder what the word would be. I've got to think about what the word is. Maybe it'll come up in the conversation. And then, of course, I won't remember it this evening when I go to do this vlog. But it's about it's a mentality. I think that's the word, mentality. So there were some people in the office that took that moment and said, okay, fine, we cannot get into our computers, we cannot do our usual work, what can we do? And a lot of people spent the day catching up with a lot of horrible filing and stuff that they hate to do, but I'm not talking about regular filing, I'm talking about the deep filing. A lot of people took the time to even tidy offices and do stuff like that. And then there were others that stood around, quite honestly, for most of the day, complaining about the fact they weren't being allowed to go home. It was an interesting division, if you like, of people. And as you know, I've got a 15-year-old co-op student with me at the moment. And she and I kept pretty busy. I kept her busy until lunchtime. And at lunchtime, when she went home, because she goes home for her lunch, I said, stay home, don't worry. I mean, I could have kept her busy all afternoon, but I decided I'd just let her go home. I mean, it would have been giving her make work stuff rather than stuff. So it wasn't her fault. I just said stay home. But she was wonderful. The point I was trying to make here was that I said to her, you know, whenever this situation occurs in your life, be part of the group that just finds things to do. And the reason for that is people see that and they don't forget that. And when I say that, it's a case of, you know, if a company has to downsize, if a company has to do whatever, they will remember who worked and who couldn't wait to go home. And at one stage they even came to me and said, you know, that I should go and talk to one of the bosses and get everybody sent home. And I didn't. Why? Because if they wanted everybody sent home, they would have done it already. There was so much, I have to be quite honest, there was so much people could have done and chose not to do. And I was so impressed with certain people, ones that I will certainly take some time to congratulate today quietly on my own, because it's not about company stuff, it's about my personal morality, if you like. I was just really impressed how many of them worked hard. And it's important to see that, I think. So what sort of person are you? What is your mentality? If you'd gone to work and all the electricity or hydro, whatever you call it, wherever you are, if that had gone, and by the way, it started to get quite cool and even quite dark. And I will get back to that. But in the meantime, what sort of personality are you? What sort of mentality do you have? Do you do as little as possible or as much as possible? And how much stress is it on any business owner that they've got that many people that they're paying to stand around doing diddly? That's a lot of stress. Now, I must admit that I probably would have done a balance of that. I probably would have said, obviously it's not going to be a highly productive day, so let me keep a skeleton staff of people and let the rest go home. In other words, I would have probably kept a receptionist, a secretary or two, and an accounts person, and, you know, just basically said, for the rest of you, if you choose to go home and not get paid, that's your right. Yeah, go right ahead. Please notice, and not get paid. I wonder how many people would have decided to stay if that had been the option, and stay without muttering. So it was a really, really fascinating time. Now I just want to talk about my my co-op student, because before I said to her, you know, don't bother to come back, she was on her way to lunch, and I said, oh, do me a favor, bring me back a hot coffee, because you can understand it was getting cool, and my feet were getting cold, even my boots. I have you know, not fur boots, I have just regular boots on, and my feet were getting cold. And so when she heard me say to her, you know, don't worry about coming back, her immediate reaction was, what about your coffee? And I'd also ordered up a coffee for a colleague of mine. And I said, no, no, don't worry. And she said, but you're cold. And I said, really, don't worry. And she said, I'm going to bring it anyway. Well, you know how much I like that. That showed great mentality in my view. And then I said, well, if you're going to bring it anyway, bring a box of coffee. Now, Tim Hortons, which some of you know is a big Canadian thing, and some of you have it in the States, Tim Hortons makes a box of coffee like you have boxed wine. They make boxed coffee. It's very clever. And it has like 10 cups of coffee in it. Well, bless her heart, she arrived not only with a box of coffee, but also a box of donuts to go with it. Well, hello! How nice was that? So, I thought that was so kind of her. So made she didn't arrive with a blankie for me as well. Yeah. So a little thing, perhaps, but a big thing. By the way, her daddy refused to let us pay for the coffee or the donuts, as much as I tried. So I went all the way downstairs and went out into the parking lot and personally thanked Daddy for his kind gift to the office, because to me, that's the very least I could do, is go out of my way to thank him. So we've been talking all week about our interpretation of things, and whether it is the spoken thing or the body language thing or the kind gesture thing. Is it not true that we interpret everything? The saddest thing was yesterday, somebody, for whatever their reasoning, up and shot a Canadian soldier standing guard at our tomb of the unknown soldier. And, you know, so many Canadians' reaction was, what? In Canada? You know, we really do believe that we are such a peace-loving group of people that, you know, why would anybody do that to us? But they did. And so it was a very sad day. And then you hear all the extreme thoughts related to a particular religion, and you're going, you know, this is so insane. This is about extremists. This is not about your regular people at all. And I hasten to remind people who tell me, you know, well, it's all these Muslims, and you can hear in their voice tone. And I go, yes, and do any of you remember the Crusades? And they go, what? And I always ask that question, do you remember the Crusades? Do you remember in history learning about the Crusades? So this is not about regular followers of any faith. This is about extremists. And with all due respect, in a lot of cases, somewhat unstable ones at that. So the interpretation of everything is important. If you grow up in a household where the way they control is by shame, then you grow up with a lot of guilt, and you grow up with a lot of hurt and a lot of wrong thinking in terms of the real world. You know, it's difficult to grow up from a childhood of shame. Some of you grow up with a childhood of love. I'd like to suggest that's probably few and far between, but I believe some do. And so then, in a way, it's almost as difficult for those people, because now you've got to get a taste of the real world, because the real world is not quite as loving as you would believe. So your interpretation of the world needs to shift. And then some of us grow up in a world that is not trustworthy. In other words, we put our trust in people who turned out to be anything but trustworthy. And therefore, in our own way, we are damaged in terms of our trust levels. And we need to interpret the world differently as well, because we have to learn how to trust again. And then guess what? Every now and then you learn how to trust only to find out that was yet again another untrustworthy person. And so for a lot of people, our interpretation of the world is one of not being able to trust anybody around us. It's a lonely place as well. And so I'm actually going to be continuing on this subject in different ways over the course of the next few weeks. But if you can understand, and that's all that I really wanted to make sure that we did, and we did it solidly, is that it's not what happens to you, it's our interpretation of what happens to us that makes our lives happy or sad. Remember the situation when I was in court, okay? I could have been totally shamed by that. I chose to be totally amused by it and saw it as a great memory. It was an interpretation. For a second, I was obviously horrified that I had not known the rules, but there were no rules. You know, in that split second I said, where did it say don't take your coffee into court? It didn't. Now, some people could say, but you should know better. Well, I didn't. And I reckon I'm fairly well versed in these things, but I certainly didn't know that. I couldn't believe that a lawyer went into court without one, quite honestly. And then I found out later that it's not necessarily true, just for that one judge. So everything is an interpretation. I grew up in a family where pointing at somebody was so taboo, so unheard of. You weren't allowed to point at anybody. It was considered extremely rude to actually, talk to somebody with the wagging finger, or even just, the straight finger. It was considered incredibly rude in my upbringing. Now, do you think that people wag their fingers at me all over the place? Yes. And most of them, I can just ignore. I just don't interpret it in the same way. In fact, I have to remind myself that I grew up in a different way, and my upbringing was very different from that. It was considered very bad behavior, very rude. And then I remember to interpret this in a way of, hopefully, of grace. And I say, and I was very fortunate to have grown up in an environment where I was taught that. And I was very fortunate that my parents sent me to a very good school that upheld that and taught me some pretty good manners along the way, some of which I have totally lost. I'm thinking about slurping gravy off my plate every now and then. Don't tell anybody about that. Yeah. Yeah. So some things I definitely do not keep to. But it's all an interpretation of, what's good manners. Why do we shake hands with our right hands rather than our left? There's a reason for it. It was a safety reason. So that would normally be the hand in which you were carrying a knife in the medieval days or whatever. And so it was a way of saying, hi, I wish to tell you that I'm not carrying a knife. Now, how many of them carried their knives on the left hand on principle, just so that they could shake with one hand and stab them with the left? I don't know. But that was the interpretation. I come in peace. I come without a knife. Boom. Open hand. So look at your life and see how many of the interpretations that you have to do with whether you were brought up in shame or with love or with lack of trust or whatever it was. How many of your interpretations come from what you were taught? From maybe your teachers? Teachers are really good at teaching you what you have to do. Well, it is such a load of crock, isn't it? I mean, really, think about it. You don't have to do anything, and I wish that teachers could actually keep control without saying you have to. And I believe that it's possible. I'm not sure that I could do it, but I believe it is possible for people with great patience. Ooh! There's a tree down there in somebody's yard. Fell right over.